thank you to everyone for joining us today. It's good to be here. It's good to be talking about these things. So this session is remote first team interactions with Team Topologies. We thought we'd share some experience and ideas that we've had, a few concepts from our Team Topologies book, but also just to try and get some discussion going about what it means to be remote first as part of a team, and to get some ideas flowing around and sharing so that everyone can benefit. So there'll be two parts. There'll be a bit of a presentation first. Manuel will be doing most of that. And then we'll have a Q&A in the second half of the session. So each half is about 30 minutes. So over to you, Manuel.
Thank you, Matthew. So yeah, I hope I won't go too much beyond 30 minutes. So the idea is to give you some techniques and some approaches that you might want to try around team interactions in this kind of remote first context we are today. And we've been talking about this for the last few weeks, and there are a lot of resources around for a single team to be effective working remotely, what kind of things you should be looking at, but there's not a lot in terms of interactions between different teams. So by the way, this is a stock photo of Madrid. Just kind of looked a bit empty, but I definitely did not go outside to take photos. I'm staying home, as we all should right now. So for many people, especially people who are new to the idea of remote working, they might think that, well, it's just about, you know, having video calls with Zoom instead of face-to-face meetings, and we have Slack or some other tool for chatting. But I'm guessing most of you have had experience working remotely, and you know that this is definitely not enough. It's not just about the tools, it's a lot more. And so when you have kind of poor understanding of remote first work, then this is going to drive perhaps more problems, more distance between different teams. So when you're talking about approaches like DevOps, where you expect teams to collaborate on a regular basis, then remote working can actually make that more difficult, and even perhaps stress some kind of pre-existing issues between teams might become more evident. And so it's not just the tools, it's also all the kind of the ground rules and practices around remote working that make it more than just working from home, right? So, you know, establishing what are our working hours, the response times, when should we do video conferencing or not, you know, being careful, mindful of tone of communication, how do we make decisions, all these things are part of the effective remote working, is having clarity on all these aspects. So me and Matthew co-wrote the book, Team Topologies, Organizing Business and Technology Teams for Fast Flow. So the book was published in September last year, so obviously it was not in the context of the pandemic that we're going through today, and that everyone or everyone that can is working from home. But a lot of the ideas that we talk about in the book, we think are applicable and useful for remote first context, especially around interactions between different teams. So we want to share some of those ideas that we think are directly applicable today. So the agenda looks a bit like this in 4 parts: visualizing dependencies, setting team boundaries, you know, making sure our interactions are purposeful, and feedback at the end. So in this kind of remote first context, it's vital, first of all, before we look at dependencies, to understand what different teams are working on, right? If we depend on another team to provide us some piece of work, then it should be possible to, and visible, what are they working on today. And turns out the best way to start visualizing the work is to start with our own team, right? Exposing to others what are we doing. So we talk about the idea of a team API or team interface in the book, in Team Topologies. And we think that it's really important for, you know, it's kind of effective team first ownership of software, that the teams continuously define, advertise, test, and evolve their team API. So this is something we had in the book. And again, this becomes even more important in a remote first context where you don't have that kind of face-to-face interaction. And so you need to actively promote your team API. In what are the ways we expect to interact with other teams that are effective? What are we working on? A whole set of things you can have in that simple team API. So these are just, this is not an exhaustive list, it's just some ideas, what artifacts we work on. If we're responsible for developing code, for example, how do we version the code? Do we allow other teams to make pull requests on our code repositories? How do we test, etc. But any kind of artifacts the team is produced, the wiki, documentation, but very importantly as well, what are the practices we adopt, the principles for the team, and the preferred communication channels, which tools and patterns, what time of the day is good to ask us to discuss some aspects, or when are the support hours, etc. And the last one, of course, very important, what are we working on today and in the near future, whatever our roadmap is, if it's monthly or quarterly, or just exposing that to everyone becomes really important. So kind of the first step to understand what different teams are working on is to expose our own kind of API, if you like. So we actually have a GitHub repository which has a template for Team API, which is essentially just point information that you can expect to have for a team that is trying to expose, their preferred interface and ways of working. So this is very simple to do as an internal wiki or what have you. So it clarifies for the other teams what to expect from your team. And then we can look at dependencies between teams and start tracking those as well. So this image or this table is actually an example that was based on something that the original Spotify model article, or the article that originated the idea of the Spotify model, talked about as well, which was to track dependencies between teams. So the value is not in this spreadsheet itself. It can be anything that makes sense for you to use, but kind of having the information on how dependencies between teams are evolving over time. So that what we want to try to do is kind of eliminate blocking dependencies. If teams depend on others for parts of the work that then become kind of wait time, we want to reduce that. We want to mitigate slow dependencies where teams are slowing down when they're waiting for other teams to work on some piece of work, and keep healthy dependencies. If they're not causing problem, then it's okay. So in the book, in Team Topologies, we talk a lot about stream teams and semi-autonomous teams, but we know there are always dependencies. What we want to do is, again, minimize dependencies, but keep the healthy ones and address the problems with blocking or slow dependencies. So I'm not going to detail here because we don't have time, all the different types of teams we talk about in the book, but effectively, what we propose in the book is some fundamental topologies and interaction modes that help minimize dependencies on the delivery workflow. A great book around managing work and kind of making work visible and reducing unplanned work and things like this, and making dependencies between teams visible is Making Work Visible, the book by Dominica de Grandis, that really has in-depth thinking about this type of ideas. So highly recommend that. Some of the things she talks about might need to be kind of transformed for remote work or adapted, but generally the ideas remain valid and super useful. And we want to keep socialization between teams, so obviously at the distance now, but we don't want to forget that this is a very important aspect in any organization, that you have social networks between teams as well. So many teams are talking about or are doing kind of coffee breaks inside their own team. So if people normally would go have a coffee at 10 a.m., for example, then they make a break and they have a either Slack channel or video conference, so they're having their coffee together and perhaps talking about things that are not related to work, and that's great. But think about promoting this kind of things between teams as well. So especially if you're in kind of management position, try to promote that. Perhaps invite another team once a week to join your coffee break, your virtual coffee break, so you can keep that kind of interaction ongoing. Or you can tell your team members and then individuals to just keep that kind of relationships going with people from other teams, because that's important to keep this kind of organizational network going on. And also, if you have other kind of more structured community building initiatives in the organization, either communities of practice or lunchtime talks or whatever you might have, try to keep them in this remote setting as well. So for example, I gave a remote talk at SAP, the kind of enterprise management software company. So they're very big and distributed around the world. So they already did this remotely, where they invite someone to talk and anyone can join from around the world. And they also record it and make it available internally. So if you're not doing that yet, make sure you think about that and you start some initiatives on not only for the content itself, but to keep the network and to keep the communities growing, because that's going to be very important in the medium to long term as well. So now changing slightly into how do we set boundaries around what teams should be responsible for, and how do we manage the interactions. So there's different trust levels depending on the size of the groups that people belong to. Robin Dunbar did a lot of research. Also, he's an anthropologist, so he's been looking at throughout different civilizations, how are the social networks of people, how many meaningful connections they can have. And so he found out, as it's saying here, an individual social network, meaningful relationships, is typically in the order of 100 to 200 individuals. So people talk about about Dunbar's number as 150, which is kind of the average there, but it's obviously not an exact number, but it's just how many people we can know enough and that they have a meaningful relationship with us. So we know who they are, we know what they work on, we know how that relates to what we do in the organization. And so this is something important to keep in mind, this kind of limit to where when we go beyond this sizing of groups, beyond this 100 to 200, the dynamics change. Interestingly, in the military, so Ben Ford is talking here in this article about social inflection points, in the sense of different sizes of groups lead to different kind of behaviors and the way that people see themselves as part of that group. So we should be looking at that when we're organizing our structures, our teams and departments and so on. So we talk about that in the book as well, a bit more in depth. But keep in mind that it's not just the 150 number, but there are other kind of meaningful numbers. So for example, 15 is kind of the number of people we can trust deeply, that we can work very effectively on a daily basis. And so when we talk about size of teams, for example, there's the 2 pizza rule kind of aspect, which makes sense for technology teams. Typically 7 ± 2 people is the right size in general for a team. But if you had kind of deep trust, you could go up to 15 people in the same team and still consider that to be a team and not just a grouping of people. But again, the point is that, as we're saying here, the trust dynamics can change when you're crossing these boundaries of group sizing. And then you should expect different behaviors and effects. So in practice, how can we leverage this? We have a case study from AutoTrader in the book, which is quite interesting. The way they set up their office building was that in each floor you had every team and everyone working on the same kind of business domain. So they are arranged by the business value streams, if you like. So this is an example. It's not the exact what they had, but if you have kind of private car sales, commercial car sales, and car leasing as 3 different value streams and business areas, then everyone working on car leasing, for example, would sit on the same floor, both technology as marketing, sales, whoever belonged in that domain. And so this promoted good kind of interactions between those people that actually need to communicate on a regular basis, even if not every day or even every week, but it would be easy for someone in the technology team to talk to someone in marketing or sales, because the physical space is conducive to that. So, of course, the question is, how do we translate this to remote world? And perhaps having this huge Slack for the whole organization or whatever other tool is probably not the right way to go about it. Because if you think about individuals in this kind of huge Slack, is they're probably not going to feel like they might have doubts about, where do I belong? What should I be looking at? What should I be responding to or not? And even this kind of feeling of lacking, of not feeling part of a group, of not feeling this togetherness of, this is my group and the people I work directly with. So probably one huge Slack is not a very good idea. But we also you don't want to have Slacks per team, for example, because then you're not promoting interaction between teams. So perhaps those value streams, those business domains might be a good way to start. This is not a rule, it's just a suggestion. Thinking about, smaller Slacks where you might limit the amount of people in that Slack to 150, 200 might be a good way to go about it. In order also to reduce noise, to make it easier for people to navigate the Slack or the communication tool you're using, make it easier to find, which channels should I be looking at, where should I be, actively participating in discussions or not, or eventually, occasionally looking at what's going on in this other channel, helping people navigate and find information easily, as well as respond to information in the right place. And so more specifically for one, let's say we have one Slack for one of these business domains, then again, these are just suggestions, but you would expect obviously that each team has their own channel where they can communicate fluidly. So this is, of course, using the terminology in Team Topologies. So if you have a platform team, they would have their own Slack. If you have an enabling team around test automation, they would have their own channel, stream teams would have their own channels. But then also start thinking about how can we promote good and easy communication between teams that are expected to interact, at least for a period of time. So let's say, on the left at the bottom, you see there's a channel for a stream team 1 and the platform team. If they're collaborating because they're working on some new monitoring service for the platform, they're discovering how this service should work, then it probably makes sense to have a temporary channel for that. And perhaps the stream team 2 is being helped by enabling team around their test automation practices, then would make sense to have a channel for that as well. And these channels can come and go when we no longer need them. If we have platform services, if you look on the right and at the top, if you have services for creating environments on demand or logging, then you have support around it and you want to use a Slack channel, then you could have those kind of dedicated channels as well. So for example, having a single support channel for the whole platform, if you have multiple services, is probably going to be too much noise. And questions are going to be lost, or people can't find information. So perhaps structuring per service that you're supporting might work well. And of course, over time, you have to see what works and what doesn't, and improve that. and yeah, and any other channels that you need for the teams that work in that business domain, of course. In terms of the individual profiles, would be good to have people include not just their name, but also what type of, which team they work on and which role they have. So again, this was kind of focused on the terminology we use in the book, but if you're not using this topologies, but you have your own terminology in terms of, we call this application teams and support teams and whatever that might be, the idea still stands, that make the channels and the way you're communicating in those tools very clear to everyone. And of course, have all the other channels for informal communication, talking about music or movies or just random jokes, whatever you might have, though that's obviously important as well. Having some conventions, as I was saying, around how do we create these channels and how people present themselves can be very useful. Again, these are just ideas. This is not some rules or that we're proposing, just things you can think about that might be helpful to have clear virtual space. Another aspect that it's important to talk about is Conway's Law. So if for people who might not have come across Conway's Law yet, it's actually from 1968 by Mel Conway, where he says, any organization that designs a system defined broadly will produce a design whose structure is a copy of the organization's communication structure. So essentially he's saying there's this mirroring effect between, on one hand, the team structures and communication paths in your organization, and on the other hand, the kind of system architecture and design that we want to produce. The two things are going to look very similar. And so this implies that decisions we make on the communication lines in the organization influence the architecture of software and the kind of patterns and design that we can achieve with our organization. So a lot of people have talked about something called the reverse Conway maneuver, which is effectively taking advantage of this mirroring effect. So in kind of very simple example, if you were trying to achieve this kind of system architecture where you're decoupling data, then you would expect the team structures to kind of mirror this to some extent or to a large extent. So if you shift this 90 degrees, you would have different teams that need the kind of the skills to be able to own those slices, those different microservices, including database skills and API and application development. Kind of a simple way would be to, if you can kind of mirror the system architecture with the team structures, that then you're not fighting this Conway's Law, you're actually taking advantage. But if you can't change neither of those, because that's not within your kind of reach today, we can at least try to reduce kind of the friction points with clear communications. And again, these friction points might become more frequent in a remote setting. So if we have this kind of team structures where perhaps we have a centralized database administration team, then we're going to have some friction if we're trying to achieve those microservices with independent data stores, right? So if we can change that, and we know that kind of what we're going to be looking at as kind of the emerging architecture is a shared database, then at least let's try to start clarifying how can different teams communicate with the DBA team. So the DBA team having an API could be very useful to set clearly what are the preferred working times, ways to reach the DBA team, so that we have these frictions going on in terms of what we're trying to achieve with the software, but at least we have clarity on what's the best way to communicate and clear out some of the issues we might be having, especially in remote first context. And looking at Slack and communication channels, then in this scenario, then besides the channels for the different application teams and for the DBA team, then again, having channels for pairs of teams, DBA and application team A, for example, to have a space where they know this is where we can easily reach out to the other team and talk about any problems that we have, can be quite useful. So I'm reaching my time limit, so I'll try to be quick. Purposeful interactions, so making sure we are having the right types of interactions and we know why we're having them. I want to do a couple of myth busting. One is this idea of kind of almost infinite collaboration between everyone. We just cannot, and we should not expect, apologies, we should not expect to talk to everyone else in the organization or even in this department, because that's not feasible. So what we need is well-defined interactions to actually, you know, make this effective for teams. And particularly with DevOps, at some points there was this idea that, well, what we need is everyone to collaborate with everyone, and that's not necessarily effective. We need to understand what kind of interactions we should have and for what purpose. So again, I'm not going into detail, but these are the 3 interaction modes that we talk about in the book, with a clear purpose, where in collaboration you have 2 teams working together to discover some aspect, whether a new platform service or solving a problem where there's a dependency between 2 teams or 2 parts of a system. You can have X as a service, which is where one team provides a service that the other consumes, and you don't expect regular interaction. You expect that this service is stable and being used by others. But of course, there should be, you know, a way to provide feedback and ask for support and so on. But this is not kind of an ongoing interaction. And then facilitating, where one team is helping another upskill or acquire some knowledge and yeah, improve their practices and so on. So these are very clear purpose and types of interactions that we're talking about. And so it's in general, they are time frames. So X as a service, not, because it's something that doesn't require regular interaction, but collaboration facilitating should be time framed, where we expect to collaborate for 2 weeks or a month in order to find out, you know, how this monitoring service should look like, how it should work, and then we expect that to be over. And so the other advantage of, if you have these fundamental topologies and interaction modes, is you start being able to have this kind of organizational landscape view of your teams, and you can see, you know, which types of teams do we have, what are they working on, but also how are they interacting at this moment in time. You should look at this as kind of a snapshot, where, you know, we see that there's 2 stream-aligned teams, platform team, labeling team, and we see who they are working with, and that is going to help us make sense of where we are at now as an organization, and help drive kind of the evolution that we expect. And again, in a remote context, this becomes even more important, where you don't have the face-to-face interactions between different teams, and kind of more fluid communication between teams. And at the same time, it helps us to understand when these team interactions are not playing out as we expected, then that's kind of a signal that perhaps we need to evolve, and we need to think about what should we do next. For example, if a stream team, if there's a platform service that's expected to be stable and used by everyone, but actually we're getting a lot of support requests, that means perhaps it's not that service might be stable, but it's not easy to understand, it's not easy to use, and so we need to work on that again. We need to collaborate again with a stream team to make the service kind of more resilient, with a better user experience. The other myth is that looking at the organization chart as kind of telling us how we should communicate. especially in very large organizations, where you have this nice org chart where you expect, well, these teams are, that are under the same line probably should communicate. But in fact, when you look at it, the reality is very different. You have much more of a networking effect where teams between different groups, different departments need to interact and talk to each other. So the organization chart is useful for compliance and for helping, hopefully healthy kind of reporting up and down the org chart, but it's not really something we should look at as this is how we should be communicating. So I like to talk about this example based from the book Team of Teams, again, from a kind of military background, but where he's saying that the author is saying that, if you look at the org chart on the left, this is what we think we're designed for, but what we're facing is more like on the right, is more of a network that we need to navigate. And also to point out that, so Niels Plafjing, I'm sure that's not how you pronounce his name. He's in his book Organized for Complexity. He's talking about the different kind of communication structures that actually take place besides the org chart. So you have informal structures, the connections between people, and value creation structure, which is more around the team structures. And those two are the keys to successful knowledge work, if you like, and software delivery in particular, rather than looking at the org chart as, this is how we're supposed to interact and communicate. And then I just thought this is an interesting example where someone, was prevented from having lunch with people on another team because all the communication was expected to go through his manager. So it's, again, looking at the org chart as if that's the dictating the communication path. So you don't want to have that, and you don't want to have that, remotely either, where people are for some reason prevented from talking to others. In fact, should be promoted, those kind of informal communication between people in different teams. A quick note: decision making is not just about direct communication with chat or video tools. I'm not an expert on that, so I recommend following people from the Basecamp company. So here they're talking about, it's not about replacing office meetings with video calls, and you need to think about more, how do we make decisions? How do we record decisions? What should we write down? How do we make things easy to access? So I recommend, there's an overload of information today about how to work remotely. I think if you don't know where to start, I recommend looking at companies that have been doing this for years, not just weeks or months. They've been doing this for years, even decades. So Basecamp, the people from Basecamp wrote this book on the left, Remote Office Not Required. They've always worked remotely, as well as GitLab has resources as well. So because today it's very easy to get overloaded with information, I think it's good to look at people or companies that have been doing this for a long time and went through a lot of iterations on how we make this effective. We want to clarify, so I talked about this already a bit, clarifying communication purpose and channels. In particular for platform teams, you have teams providing services to others. We also have a GitHub repository that provides a template for what we call a thin platform. So I'm not going into detail around that, but again, similar to Team API, but if you have this kind of platform, it's even more important that you have this kind of information available around which services exist, how do you access them, etc. How do I know what's the status of this service today? What are the adequate communication channels? How should you ask for support or give feedback and so on? Incident response, I'm gonna have to do this very quickly. Again, the expert or one of people who have been talking a lot about this idea of swarming for responding to incidents is John Hall. He has this great article And he's basically advocating for three-tier support, the classical three-tier support, to be replaced with swarming. And he has this, that great article. He works for BMC. We talk a little bit about swarming for incident resolution in Team Topologies as well. But essentially what I wanted to tell you from here is that, if you're using swarms, which is basically getting people from different teams to work together to be able to much more quickly identify, kind of diagnose high severity problems and fix them much faster than with a three-tier approach. Then we want to think about the communication tools and setup according to this as well. So the point I'm trying to make in this part is that the way we set up our virtual space should also think about this. If we're doing swarming for incident response, we should set this up in advance. So it's not when we're going through problems that we should be thinking about how do we communicate, do we have a channel or not. This should be set up in advance, of course. When do we do video conferencing? When do we use perhaps Slack channels dedicated for different swarms? Having game days so that people will play through how an incident resolution would work with the swarms through scenarios that are created artificially to reproduce some possible incidents. Get those things going in advance, not when you need them for real. And finally, very quickly on feedback, because it's a very, very important aspect, of course. We need constructive feedback, and there are many resources around how to provide positive feedback, actionable feedback, and so on. But it's also a skill that you need to grow inside the organization and promote. And the more important today in this remote context where it's much easier to misunderstand people, to forget about providing feedback that on things that go well, not just what the problems that might happen. So this is becomes critical skill, being able to provide constructive feedback. So one example at Twilio, what they do is the platform team in particular, I think every quarter, they send out this survey where they ask the teams using the platform to tell them, if they feel like it's, helping them build and run their services effectively, if it's a compelling platform, and if their feedback and the problems that they're reporting are being fixed. But you don't need to do this just on a quarterly basis. You can have this kind of check-in much more regularly with other teams. But this is an interesting example that works well for them. And just to finalize, of course, this is a discovery period for a lot of organizations. And so you need to try out things, see what works, what doesn't. It's important not to just let team interactions run their course and just see what happens. We should, like we've seen in this talk and these ideas, make those interactions have a purpose and try out things, what works, see what works, what doesn't. And if you're a manager of a team or a number of teams, try to follow up and experiment and see, get feedback from the teams and your team members so that, you find what are the good ways for promoting team interactions in your organization. So again, this is the book, Team Topologies. We're actually, what's coming next after this session, and as we also grow our understanding of problems that organizations are facing, is we'll create a workbook, a free workbook around team topologies for remote teams. We don't know the exact date yet, but of course we want this to come out soon. So if you're interested, you can sign up to teamtopologies.com/newsletter, but also IT Revolution, the publisher, also has their newsletter. They also will probably send an email about that, or on social media, whatever is more useful for you. We do training around Team Topologies. We're actually right now in the process, as many of you, of transforming this to remote only or remote first training and consulting. But again, it's all on the website, teamtopologies.com, if you're interested. And yeah, I went over my time, but I think we still have 20 minutes for QA and discussion. So the idea now is not just questions about the talk, is you're welcome, but just discussion, what kind of problems you're facing, any kind of super useful advice you might have. The way we were planning to do this is to ask people to raise their hand. So in Slack, so you're all muted, just to keep the kind of background noise and people not talking over each other. But if you want to participate, then you can, if you go to the list of participants, there should be a button to raise your hand. And then Matthew, you will unmute and we can discuss.
So yes, to anyone who needs to leave the session now, thank you very much for attending. It's been good. It's been good to have you as part of the session. We'll be making the slides available later, and to those people who want to join in the discussion, that's great. We'll be here till for another 20 minutes, just less than 20 minutes. So let's go for the first. Let's go for the first question. Who wants to ask something first? So you have to go into the participant list and then kind of click on raise your hand. Has anyone been working in this sort of way for an extended period of time? Is there anyone on the call for whom all this stuff is just completely normal? And what's the problem? It all feels very straightforward for you. It'd be great to hear from someone who's got that kind of experience. If anyone feels brave enough to do that, let's have a look. The other thing, of course, is that doing this kind of thing at a big scale. So as soon as we get to beyond Dunbar's number, beyond about 150 people, then we're going to expect different trust dynamics, different kind of dynamics in general, social dynamics inside the organization. So you may have done remote first. So Manuel and I have been doing remote first. I mean, I've been doing it since 2014, and we've been working together since 2015. So for us, it's kind of fairly familiar. But as soon as you get outside of that kind of small group, and certainly as soon as you go over about 150 people, then we're expecting the dynamics to change. So we have to effectively design the virtual space. That's what we're talking about. So who have we got here? Henry, I can see. So give me a second. Here we go. Henry, do you want to, have I unmuted you? Yeah, you should be able to talk now. Great. Hi.
How are you doing? All right. I suppose that my viewpoint is we've been using Microsoft Teams, which is different. So I was interested in one, if anyone else was using that as opposed to Slack. So we've got, so we're doing something similar in terms of creating teams per groups of about, I suppose, up to 50, about 50 to 100. But then obviously you can be in multiple teams and they've all got loads of channels. So I think part of the problem is you get smaller teams are using it for themselves, but it's getting that cross communication sometimes doesn't happen that way. Particularly,
well, there's going to be a particular challenge if you've got people who see themselves as in multiple teams.
Yeah.
I don't know whether you've read the Team Topologies book, but you'll see that's something which we kind of argue very strongly against, and we want this kind of sense of really clear ownership around where people sit, so you can create a kind of team API and define the interactions a bit better. So that might be contributing to some of the challenges possibly.
Yeah, I think it's more that we have teams that I suppose, yeah, the API isn't clearly defined in terms of how they should help other teams. So like you've got two different delivery teams that are facing similar problems, but not really talking to each other to help them out. And I suppose my responsibility is to make the communities of practice work in that sense. So what I'm struggling with is getting people outside of their team to to talk to each other and share solutions and things like that.
That's a really nice point, actually, about the communities of practice. This is where we're going to see, I think, some stress testing of some online tools for things like communities of practice and guilds and things like this, whether it's like House Party or there's loads of other tools springing up and coming online, and people are really, really trying to see which one works well, multiple Zoom calls, whatever. But, it's bad enough when we're inside a very large building trying to get people together and have shared talks, shared tech talks and lunchtime sessions and things. The way where I'm familiar with doing that is through food, basically bribing people to attend because, hey, we've bought some food, so come along to our session. And it actually works really, really well. There's even kind studies to kind of prove the difference around this. But if we're all remote, we don't have food to bribe people. How do we kind of encourage people to kind of come and join a kind of virtual session around a guild or community of practice? It's a really good question. I don't have any easy answers.
We're actually going to try, because we had a monthly pizza session previously. Obviously we can't do that, so we're trying a virtual one next week, but yeah, don't know how that's going to go. Okay, well, if you've got any if you get any feedback from that afterwards, then share it online or drop us a note or something, and we'll have a chat and share it out with people if you're happy to do that. Yeah, definitely. That'd
be great. Anyone else? Has anyone else got some experience around this already that wants to share what they're doing? Has anyone used
if anyone wants to use this chat, you're welcome as well if you don't have a microphone.
Has anyone so whether you're using Teams or Slack or which one of these kind of tools, has anyone done some design around kind of channel names and how we searchability and things like this? Because one thing I was engineering lead for a large UK government department a couple of years ago, and there was many teams. I think it was 70 teams involved, lots of different locations. And one of the things I found that was quite challenging there was just discoverability. Like what teams are out there? Who's working on what? That there was at that time. I think it's changed now, but at that time there wasn't very much consistency about the names of channels, so it was not easy to work out which channels belong to whom and where to ask a question and all this kind of stuff. It felt a bit like the virtual equivalent of just shouting into an open office to say, "Hi, can anyone help me with this stuff?" Which you wouldn't do in hopefully you wouldn't do in a physical office. But in the virtual office, if all you've got is Slack or Teams or whatever, we need to think about the equivalent. So I'd be great to hear from anyone who's got some experience of maybe like designing that kind of virtual space. Tom Clark. So I'll just unmute you, Tom. There we go. You should be able to chat now. Hi. I think you might still be muted.
That's on my side. So there we go. The classic Zoom issue. So thanks, chaps. I really enjoyed that. So as you know, I was previously at ITV, and we had a kind of a Wild West Slack, just because of the way it kind of came into the organisation. But I did kind of try to kind of align some of the channel names in that. And I think that's something to try and avoid, unless you actually have a really top-down approach. Trying to align everything rarely works. But we had our product team name there, which is kind of the nucleus of everything, whether it was GitHub repos or DNS names, etc. And that became kind of the locus for every team. So you'd have a public channel for a particular product team, and then most teams you also have a private team-only channel for private chats. Then things like alerts that were specific to that particular team, that would go into a separate sub-channel as well, but it all be kind of predicated with a name on the top in terms of a taxonomy. And that gave us some consistency. Then everything else kind of evolved beyond that, and it was a bit of a mess.
That sounds really nice. Something that's nice and clear and simple. Everyone gets it. It allows enough freedom for teams to do other stuff. They don't have to all come forward to the same thing, but it's a kind of minimal API, if you like, a minimal way of so people understand how to interact. That sounds quite.
And then the key thing for a new team to spin up was working out what that identifier was, because that was used everywhere, which gave a load of consistency. So even from a like I said, GitHub or DNS name or Slack name or kind of other services, that would always be the identifier, not necessarily the publicly consumable one, but it'd be the identifier internally. You refer to that team as that. And so it was actually nice and consistent to recognize what something was.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point. So it doesn't surprise me that worked well, because just getting to the point where we have a name that's consistent and persistent, carries on an ongoing basis, that can be a real challenge in some organizations as well, to say, well, actually, this is a thing that is going to exist for the foreseeable future, and getting people mentally to kind of change to that way of thinking, I think is a really important step.
Yeah. And then talking about cognitive load as well, it definitely helped with that, because we were very strict on aligning to that. So actually, it wasn't like 4 different names for a team. It was that identifier was the identifier. So actually, you didn't have to double guess or kind of double think and check it up and go back to the source. You could actually rely on it and build trust.
That's a really nice example. Again, if you're happy to share more stuff online later or ping some details to us and we can share it out, then that would be awesome. Brilliant. That's great. Anyone else? We got Steve. I'll just mute you again, Tom. Thanks very much for that. It's great. And Stephen, here we go. Hi, Stephen.
Hiya, Matt. Hi, Manuel. Thanks very much. I think my question was about, so this is going to be a reality for me and for my organisation for a good period of time, I think. And one of the things we're trying to do is be more aligned, value stream aligned, and live some of these principles. And my role is to try and convince important people in the organisation to do that. And I was just kind of looking for your thoughts really on how we continue to kind of change and push that change with the kind of remote working constraints, because I think certainly, like, I'm in a large UK government organisation, there's a thought of, well, we just need to be stable, nothing needs to change, but actually there's masses that this could do, that this could accelerate a lot of the things that we're doing. So I guess I'm after your thoughts on how we continue to be more value streamed, adopt more sensible team topologies.
It's a really good question. I mean, other people, if you've got some ideas about this, then respond as well. I mean, my starting point for that would be, and this is again based on my experience and the work that I've done in the past and work with Manuel, getting teams to think about what they're responsible for and how other teams should talk to them. That team API basically sets off a kind of train of thinking that says, well, if we're responsible for this now, are we going to be responsible for it in 6 months' time, in 1 year's time? Actually, DevOps and modern cloud ways of working suggest that we should be. Okay, right. So we start to align. We're thinking about aligning on a long-term basis against that, for that thing. Does it make sense for us to align around this? Are we going to be blocked and waiting on other people? Is there something we could align against which would remove some of the handovers and blocks? So that starts to, from the bottom up, if you like, we're starting to kind of align to something that feels a bit more like a value stream. And I'm not saying it's guaranteed to happen, but it can be something useful that we can do as engineers at the kind of ground level to start pushing for that kind of way of thinking and kind of ownership and sense of team responsibility and so on. And yes, we're doing it in a very technical way, which is why we called it the API, basically, because it appeals to engineers, if you like. But it does really feel like an API. I mean, it's a direct correlate, because if we think about Conway's Law, we are going to have a boundary around the team, which mirrors the boundary of what we're responsible for. So it's kind of a lot of the things which we'd use for an API, we should be thinking about as a team as well. So it does feel like there's a really strong mirroring there. Yeah. So certainly starting from a kind of engineering coalface level, think about that kind of team responsibility and start to flesh that out, get people kind of bought into it. I mean, there are other organizations talk about a team playbook. So that's kind of fine. That's kind of ways of working internally inside the team and so on. This is more of a kind of externally facing thing. So the combination of those two, the externally facing API and internal team playbook, getting that all working, and so the team is a single unit, I think can be a powerful way to push forward some of this kind of sense of in which we need to be able to be responsible for something on an ongoing basis with minimal handoffs. And that starts to head towards a kind of stream aligned approach, I think.
Yeah, I really like that team APIs. And I think I'm going to have an investigate around that after this and maybe do some of that.
It'd be great to hear what your experience on that. So just if you're free to share it afterwards when you've got somewhere, that'd be great to hear.
Thanks.
Another thing you can, not only the team APIs, also you can start thinking, I was looking for the slide where we had just what types of teams do you have today, and something like this. And if you're trying to get to more stream aligned teams and then aligned to the business value stream, then just start mapping what do you have today, which teams exist, what are the gaps that they have, and what are the dependencies that they have on other teams that perhaps are too far away. And so how can we start? Obviously it's first getting the current state, and then you can start reasoning about, actually we would need this value stream to have more understanding of running and monitoring their services and things like this. Yeah,
absolutely. Yes, it's a very complex organization and is hard to map, but we've started to try and do that. It's a really good point. How do you know what you're changing if you don't know what's there? Yeah.
We've had a couple of organizations that actually did this, and then they talked to us after they already had done that. So just kind of mapping where they were today and what they wanted to achieve, and then you can start finding out some steps to evolve towards that.
Yeah.
But of course, in the larger the organization, the more challenging that is. But
yeah, thank you. Thanks, both of you.
Thanks, Stephen.
Welcome.
So we've come to the end of the time we've got today. I'm sure there are loads more questions. Thank you for everyone who's asked a question, and for anyone who's who's now thinking about it, and you might come up with a question later. That's also great. We're on LinkedIn. We're on Twitter. We will actually soon be launching a Slack in case you wanted an extra Slack in your life. There'll be a Team Topologies Slack coming soon. And you've got our newsletter as well. So just reach out to us. You'll find us you've already found us on social media. You've got our email addresses. We'll be pulling together the recording and slides and other kind of output from this. So if there's something you want to share in addition that you remember afterwards, or that you kind of discover and learn afterwards, please get in touch. And because we want to share this stuff as widely as possible to help as many organizations as possible to kind of adopt these sorts of ways of working. So there we go, 30 seconds before the end. Thank you very much, everyone. You can actually do a wave. I've just seen that from Tom. You can do a wave somewhere in here. How do you even do that? Oh, there's all these, we go, wave. There we go, wave. So thanks, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Take care, stay safe, bye.